The town of Hungerford, Berkshire, is a small market town. The population is about 7,000 people and around 60 miles away from London. The historical town, going back to the early 10th century, nestles on the borders of the southeast and the southwest of England. It is described as a friendly, quiet town, a place where people lived in a fairly peaceful existence. On the 19th of August 1987, the seemingly peaceful town of Hungerford would be destroyed, with lives lost, by one man who had lived in Hungerford all his life. This man was 27-year-old Michael Robert Ryan, and today's story is about the Hungerford Massacre. It all started at 12 p.m. in Savernake Forest, which is about 10 miles away from Hungerford. 33-year-old Susan Godfrey had just arrived with her 2 children for a picnic, not knowing that someone was just meters away, hidden by the trees, was watching. As they all got out of the car, Michael Ryan walked up to Susan, leaving the children in the car before marching Susan amongst the trees and into the woods and shot her dead. Later, to the authorities, it looked like he had lost his mind after an attempted rape and shot Susan several times. Michael then fled the scene in his car, leaving the children physically unharmed. The children were only to be found later by a woman who was on a walk in the woods. Up until this point, Michael never raised any concerns that he was starting to lose control of reality and became this evil killer. He was born on the 18th of May 1960. He was an only child, but with parents who doted on him. Although he seemed quiet as a child and what would be described as a loner, who was also sullen, one thing that stood out with people that knew him and the family, and that was just a very spoilt child. He got exactly what he wanted. So what made him snap that day? He had started collecting guns and became obsessed with the military. He became even more immersed in his lonely lifestyle with a passion for guns. After the attack on Susan, he took off to the Golden Arrow service station in Froxfield. Michael stopped for some petrol. He was a regular customer there, and he parked at the petrol pump. The service attendant, Kay Bob Dean, recognised Ryan, who was spending a long time filling his car and a petrol can. He then waited until he was alone, with no other customers. He then walked up to the kiosk. Michael then fired his gun, and Kay Bob Dean dived for cover. Michael then walked inside and aimed again over the counter, but the gun jammed. Michael took off, luckily leaving Kay Bob Dean alive. Michael Ryan now heading towards Hungerford, back to his home in Southview. When he arrives at the home he shares with his mother, at 12:45 p.m, he collects all his guns and loads them up in the car, and to get rid of any evidence of himself, he douses the house with petrol from the can he filled up at the garage, and then he sets fire to his childhood home. Meanwhile, his mother was out. When Ryan jumped back into the car, it wouldn't start. Now this was the beginning of the rampage in Hungerford. Now on foot, Michael can't escape. He then shoots his neighbours, who are also family friends with the Ryans. Ronald Mason was in his garden when he was shot 6 times, and then Sheila was shot with a single bullet to the head. Marjorie Jackson was next. She was shot in the back while she was in her house. Michael saw her through the window and fired. She survived her injury. 14-year-old Lisa Mildenhall was in the street with friends when Michael turned his attention to the group. He fired his gun. Lisa ran inside, having been shot 4 times. Lisa was bleeding heavily from a leg wound. Ryan is now calmly going up and down the street in Southview, and then goes to the town's common. Going through the playing fields first, Michael saw 51-year-old Kenneth Clements, who was walking with his family and dog. He was shot dead. Luckily, his family escaped any injury. From the many calls coming from Southview, police immediately linked it with the shooting at the garage. By now, Michael went back to Southview. He saw a couple of police officers who were trying to block him in from both ends of the street to try and contain him. However, the police officers were unarmed, so Ryan then shot PC Roger Barretton in the chest, killing him at 12:58 p.m. Next, a mum and daughter, Linda Chapman and Alison, were turning in towards Southview in their car when Ryan opened fire. Both Linda and Alison were shot, but Linda managed to reverse out of the way. The next victims were Linda Bright and Hazel Haslett, who were ambulance crew, responding to the emergency calls. Thankfully, they escaped. More police officers turned up. Robert Clements, who was the son of Kenneth, who had just been shot at the Common, told police that the gunman was heading west in Southview. As they went to investigate, Ryan saw them and shot at the officers. One managed to escape into a house, and the officer with Robert drove across the Common, making their escape. By 12 minutes past 1, support from Thames Valley Police Tactical Firearms Unit were on their way, and although some arrived as soon as possible, the actual whole team arrived by 2:20 p.m, and a makeshift command post was set up literally 500 yards away from Southview. George White had been called by Marjorie Jackson, who had been shot in her back in her house. She told him what had happened and asked him to collect her husband, Ivor, from work in Newbury. So as George drove along Southview, he was shot and killed instantly. Ivor suffered severe injuries but survived. As Ryan walked along, he reached the junction of Southview and Fairview Road. 84-year-old Abdul Khan, who was also in his garden, was shot and killed. Another shot was fired at a pedestrian, who was injured, as Ryan was on his way back to the Common. Police were phoning for extra assistance, but the lines were overwhelmed with so many calls coming in for help. The next victim was to be Michael Ryan's mum, Dorothy. She had returned in her car, and she shouted for him to stop, but he shot her 4 times, killing her with his Beretta. Now again heading back towards the Common, someone shouted, "Kindly stop that racket," and he shot her in the groin area. At 18 minutes past 1, 3 police officers were at the command post, and that's when they saw Ryan at the War Memorial Recreational Grounds. 26-year-old Francis Butler was walking his dog near the War Memorial Recreational Grounds when he was shot, and unfortunately he died before the ambulance arrived. Andrew Cadell was riding his bike when Ryan fired a shot. Luckily he missed the teenager. When Ryan reached Bulpit Lane, he shot and killed a taxi driver. Marcus Bernard was on his way home when this happened. Next was Priory Avenue, where John Storms had been parked in his van. It was there he was shot and injured. Now, due to the diversions from the police setup, the change of routes had affected the people driving that would end up becoming victims. Douglas and Kathleen Wainwright were visiting their son on Priory Avenue, but the diversions had led them straight to Ryan head-on due to his constant movement. Douglas was shot dead, and Kathleen was injured. Another van turned up at Priory Avenue, with Eric Vardy and Stephen Ball. Both were shot, but Vardy was killed. At 1:30, 22-year-old Sandra Hill was driving towards Priory Road. Ryan shot her, and she died from her injuries. Michael Ryan then made his way into Jack and Myrtle Gibbs' home. This was a couple who were in their 60s. He shot Jack instantly, whereas Myrtle died a couple of days later. More injuries were confirmed when Michael Ryan shot into neighbouring houses. A family driving along Priory Road, Ryan shot 34-year-old Ian Pale. He died 2 days later, and his wife and children escaped unharmed. A helicopter was at the scene now, warning the public to stay away, and by now it was 1:45 p.m, and a resident heard the warning, knowing that his grandchildren were playing on or around Priory Road. He tried to get them to safety, and although he was shot in the shoulder, it wasn't fatal. Now Ryan carried on the southeast of Priory Road, heading to John O'Gaunt's school, which is where he attended when he was younger. Although Ryan was seen going towards the school, his actual whereabouts was unknown. The tactical firearms team had the school surrounded. At 4 p.m, more officers arrived at the scene when there was a shot heard within the school at 4:40 p.m. By 5:26 p.m, police had seen Ryan after he had thrown his Kalashnikov out of the third floor window. The tactical team managed to engage with Ryan as he told them what guns and ammunition he had left. He stated that he had the Beretta as well as a grenade. He told the team he wouldn't come out unless he found out what had happened to his mother, claiming it was a mistake. Finally, at 6:52, a shot was heard. It was then that the police couldn't get a response from Ryan. But it wasn't until 8 p.m. that armed police were able to enter the building. They found Ryan in a barricaded classroom, having shot himself in the temple. The emergency services response that day was hampered. Firstly, the Thames Valley Firearms Squad were training 40 miles away. The police helicopter was in for repair, but it still managed to deploy. Only 2 police phone lines were in operation at the police station as it was under renovation, and the telephone exchange couldn't handle the amount of calls coming in. Due to what happened at Hungerford, the Firearms Amendments Act in 1988 was passed in the wake of the massacre, banning ownership of semi-automatic centre fire rifles and restricts the use of shotguns with a capacity of more than 3 cartridges in the magazine. I would appreciate it if you could like and subscribe for more content.